So, this last weekend marked the 56th anniversary of the bombing of the Baptist church in Birmingham, Alabama, where the 4 little girls were killed. And for those of you of my age, I don't know about you, but I remember this quite vividly as a kid because the girls and I are just about the same age. And it was such a shocking event for children to be murdered in a place of worship. So the Southern Poverty Law Center sent around a little explanation, which I thought I would read to you because it says it much better than I could do in my own words. Okay? So they said, in an act of terror intended to intimidate civil rights activists who used the predominantly African American church as a rallying point and organizing hub, Ku Klux Klan members planted a bomb under the building's steps. It detonated at 11:22 a.m. on Youth Sunday, a day dedicated to the church's young members, as the girls were getting ready for the service in a basement lounge. Yeah. So, I mean, many of us have been in house of worships as children, getting ready to do different activities, you know. So imagine yourself in that situation. So during his eulogy for the 4 girls, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Addie Mae Collins, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called the attack, quote, one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. He sent a telegram to then Alabama Governor George Wallace. Some of you who were my age remember him very well. And in the telegram, he told the state's top segregationalist, quote, the blood of our little children is on your hands. 10 days before the bombing, Wallace had railed against the civil rights movement in the New York Times, saying, quote, what this country needs is a few first-class funerals. At that time, violent attacks on the civil rights movement were common in the city, dubbed not Birmingham, but Bombingham. And in the decades since, researchers have laid bare the lack of political will to convict the perpetrators. Then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who many of us also remember well, blocked prosecution of the case, and the FBI failed to turn over thousands of files to prosecutors, including audio surveillance tapes. It wasn't until 1977, 21 years later, that the first of the 4 Klansmen behind the crime was brought to trial by the state attorney general and then convicted. 2 others were convicted in the mid-90s, 40 years after the crime, by federal prosecutors. A 4th died before being charged. In 1987, the SPLC would win an unrelated and unprecedented civil lawsuit against the same Klan group behind the bombing, the United Klans of America, after its members murdered a Black teenager in Alabama 6 years earlier. This was like standard fare, you know, in the country for hundreds of years. The $7 million verdict of the case that the SPLC won bankrupted the United Klans, finally putting an end to the group whose members had also killed civil rights activist Viola Liuzzo after the Selma to Montgomery March. The church bombing did not slow the momentum of the civil rights movement. Instead, it became a seminal moment that galvanized the nation and propelled the movement forward. 10 months later, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing segregation in public accommodations. I always wondered as a kid why we needed a civil rights law, a Civil Rights Act, because it was already guaranteed in the Constitution in the late 1800s. So why do we need a special thing guaranteeing civil rights that were already supposedly given to everybody? At least that's what I was taught as a little kid. What what I see now, of course, is that what they taught us in civics class in elementary school and junior high and high school was not true. Yeah, they taught us that our country was the beacon of freedom for everyone and that everyone was equal before the law. And it was only when you look closer, when you look beyond, your own family, maybe, or you look to other families who were your neighbors, that you began to see that that in fact, no, not everybody had civil rights. They had them theoretically, but in practicality, they were not there. Yeah. But it always seemed strange to me that we needed an act of Congress to give people what they already had, supposedly. Okay. So then there's a quote here from Dr. King's eulogy for the girls. And he said, "This afternoon, in a real sense, the 4 girls have something to say to each of us in their death. They have something to say to every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. They have something to say to every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. They say to each of us, black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about those who murdered the girls, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy that produced the murderers." Potent. So that's one thing, okay? Then there were 2 things that happened quite recently, just this last week, that you could say are diverse from this, but I think they have a very similar root. Okay? So one was in the Democratic debate last week, a Republican PAC, Political Action Committee, okay? That was, this Political Action Committee made an ad. It was a GOP Political Action Committee, made an ad that was aired by ABC during the Democratic debate. Did I say Democratic convention before? I meant Democratic debate. Okay, it was narrated by Elizabeth Heng, who's from Cambodia, and she was a Republican candidate, but lost for some seat, okay? So what this ad did is it showed the face of AOC, yeah, Alexandra Ortiz Cortez, and it showed her face bursting into flames, and behind it were skulls like you saw in Cambodia in the killing fields. And then this politician, Elizabeth Heng, who's of Cambodian descent, compares AOC's vision of, democratic socialism to the socialism in Cambodia that gave rise to the killing fields, which we all know killed millions of people in the 1970s. And this was aired on national TV. And, there's been a little bit of an uproar about, why ABC network would air this. But nobody's saying anything about why a Republican politician would make such an outrageous video ad to start with. Yeah. So that's another thing that happened. Then, during the Democratic debate, Beto, I cannot say his last name, or O'Rourke, yeah, so he was saying very powerfully that there was going to be a mandatory buyback program for all AK and AR rifles. Yeah, and he was passionate about this. Right after he said that, a Republican state representative tweeted, Robert Francis, which is Beto's, first and middle name, "My AR is waiting for you." That's a death threat issued by a Republican politician who is in the state Senate in Texas. Again, I'm going, what in the world is going on that politicians feel they can say these kinds of things publicly? Twitter, for once, deleted that tweet a couple of hours after it was sent. Yeah. So I look at these three things, the bombing in the church in Birmingham, what the ad, regarding AOC, the tweet regarding Beto, and I go, what's in common with these three things, okay? So I'm looking at it now. We could analyze this from many different viewpoints: sociological, psychological, structural. We can analyze from many viewpoints. I'm looking at it from a Buddhist viewpoint. What is the common denominator? First of all, the self-centered thought. Second of all, lack of respect for living beings. And third, a lack of equalizing self and others, an inability to see that others want happiness and freedom from suffering as much as we do, and that they deserve happiness and freedom from suffering as much as we do. Yeah, we don't see that. Yeah, due to the Tibetan have this expression namtok. Lama translated it as superstitions. Other translations are distorted preconceptions, which I think adequately describes them. But these thoughts that we think are true, that are utter hogwash, we believe these things, and then they they act as an aid to generate afflictions. We then act on it. Yeah. And so, due to our distorted conceptions, our inability to see sentient beings, all sentient beings, and ourselves as equal in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, which, by the way, is one of the things that interferes with our doing anything about climate change. Yeah, because we think just about economic prosperity now for some people. We're not considering wildlife, the lives of wildlife. We're not considering the lives of future generations. So, all of this and the lack of respect for living beings, all of it together, you can see how all three of these different things that I've cited come from a very common root, the self-centered thought, supported with all of its buddies and friends. Yeah. So that is why Shantideva's technique of equalizing and exchanging self with self and others, I think is so powerful because it completely hits at those false conceptions that we hold on to. And it totally insists that we must respect all life, no matter whose it is or when it is. So that is our job, isn't it? We can sit and point fingers, this politician, that politician, the KKK. All of these people need to do this meditation that Shantideva taught. But, are we going to go out and preach to those people and say, you people are just totally prejudiced and you need to get your act together and here's this book and meditate on it? Is that going to do any good? No. The more you insult people, the more you criticize them, the more they're going to push you away and say, because that's what happens when people are criticized. They get defensive. When you speak like that, you don't interest people in changing their minds. You just coagulate them more in the view they have. Okay? So 2 things. Number 1, we need to practice this ourselves because we are the only ones who can change our own mind rather than pointing the finger at everybody else. Yeah. Second, to engage in conversation with people who think differently than we do. Yeah. And try and ask them, what has your life experience been that you believe what you believe? Yeah. Try and understand people. Try and create a door of communication. Insulting them, criticizing them, railing against them doesn't change their minds. Okay? So we have to, it's a slow process, and of course we want to do everything quickly. But I think to do it effectively, it takes time, it takes us transforming ourselves, and it takes our ability to accept that other people think differently than we do, even if we consider their way of thinking flawed. Yeah? To not wish them harm, to have compassion for those people as well. Yeah. To not criticize those people for thinking us and them when we are thinking us and them regarding them. Okay? So to transform our own minds and create channels of communication with other people. And those channels of communication, if we are a good listener, that can really open people to considering other viewpoints.
The reference to what happened in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge seems to be quite, in addition to what you said, Venerable, is historically quite out of place, given that the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia was a movement against anything that was modern, intellectual, any kind of education. And in fact, the goal of the Khmer Rouge was to devolve society to agricultural utopia, where they lived out in the countryside without any modernization, without any education. And so they proceeded to persecute and kill anyone who was considered educated, intellectual, influential, powerful, rich, because they wanted to go back to that kind of a society. And so it just shows the extremism in views, because that's not at all what Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is wanting to put in place at all. So it seems to me that is a travesty of I don't know what to call it. It's like he's not faithful to history. He's not faithful to what really happened there. Doesn't show things honestly.
Yeah. The comparison is incorrect.